Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing right now.
To our first presenter, who's a research geek, and she cannot wait to connect with non-research geeks. We all have to deal with how many mobile devices? Oh, just one? Lucky you. Some of us have to carry 7. Well, I don't carry that many, at least not that I know of. Either way, it can be a pain in the neck. And so doing some research, specifically with Microsoft research in this particular field, is Amy Karlson. So, welcome, Amy.
Hi there. It's great to be here today at GnomeDex. I'm going to be talking today about an exploration I led with some of my fellow colleagues at Microsoft Research, where we were looking into improving workflow and productivity in our increasingly multi-device lives. But before going straight into the content, I'm going to give you a little bit of context for what it means for those of you that don't know that I work for Microsoft Research. Because even though it is a division of Microsoft, it's unique in many ways. And so one thing that's unique, we have offices worldwide, but in Redmond, we have about 350 researchers, and we all work in the same building, shown in red, on the corner of campus. And we basically operate like a big computer science department. And like a computer science department, our mission is to improve the state of the art in computer science. And so what that means is we do research, and we publish heavily at conferences and in journals, and obviously where appropriate and where it makes sense, we transfer technology and ideas into products. But it sort of comes first from advancing the state of the art in computer science. And so I work, just like in computer science department, it's sort of broken down into little divisions, and I work in the visualization and interaction group, where we work on things involving how to improve the relationship between humans and computers. And so we have experts in information visualization and interaction techniques and things like computer-supported collaborative work, telepresence. You'll notice 2 of our team members are actually monitors because they're remote. One lives in Maine and the other lives in the Silicon Valley area, and they look at how technology can be used to help bring sort of remote participants into teams better. So that's just sort of a general background. So a few of us were inspired by a basic scenario. So these are the devices I have in my life. So I have an internet-enabled television and a personal laptop at home. And then at work, I have a work laptop and a work PC. And of course, I have my phone that is on me at all times and sort of travels between these 2 spaces. And when I look at an average day, I actually touch all of these devices typically at one point or another. And this is a typical pattern for me, and it's pretty easy to follow. But the thing that I look at in this picture is that each of these blue lines represents a context switch between one device and the other, and an opportunity to improve the experience when I move between these devices. Now, I make that a statement, but actually it's an open question. Like, well, maybe, is it really an opportunity? If that depends on the fact that my tasks that I'm doing or what I'm doing on one device actually has any relevance to what I'm doing on the other. It may be meaningless that I use my phone and then I go to my PC, right? And so that's sort of the fundamental question we wanted to understand is, what is the relationship and can we improve these transitions? So the more general problem is that we generally don't have one personal computer anymore. We have this personal ecosystem of computers that we sort of move between throughout the day, at each time sort of picking the one that provides us the best functionality or convenience or portability or whatnot. And ideally, they would all just sort of work happily together, but the reality is that they still work in relative isolation from one another. So if there's data I need on one that I need on the other as well, typically I need to either, and you can think about like files. This is a little bit different than things that are sort of web-based, but I may have to pre-plan that that's something I need on a different device and make some sort of manual movement of data. Maybe I'll email myself some things or whatnot. These are things that I have to do myself, and the burden is on me. But ideally, we want them to work together. And so we looked into, once again, we go back to what is the relationship between these devices and how do we make these transitions better? So we started out by focusing on what we thought were 2 important types of device, the mobile phone and the personal computer. And so this is what we sort of focused on, how do we sort of create the relationship between these more tightly? And how do you go about doing that? Well, you can ask people, what's the relationship, what kinds of things do you do on your phone that you want to do on your PC and vice versa. But actually, we thought it would be much more interesting to start just understand how people are using these devices. So we started out by kind of separating them and actually logging people's activities. So we put loggers on people's their mobile phone and their primary work computer, and we recruited 16 people to do this, and we logged them for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, we looked at the data. And so first I'm going to show you what the temporal relationships between people's device interaction is. And so this is someone's, a 24-hour period of someone's day with their phones and their PC. And the top line is their desktop or laptop, whichever it was. And the bottom line is the phone. And the darker area of the phone line are when they're making phone calls. So clearly they're using their phone for things other than phone calls, not surprisingly. And if you just sort of break down the day, it's not hard to sort of figure out what they're doing, right? They get up and they check their phone the first thing, like many of us do. And when they're sort of computing use moves to the PC, it's probably when they get into the office. They've got a break, maybe it's lunch, they touch their phone again, and so on. And then at the end of the day, it's clear they sort of leave the office and their computing activities transition back to their phone. And so the phone is sort of being used to sort of extend their access to something, or so it seems, beyond the desktop. So you could ask sort of, well, that's one person's day. How typical is that of this user? And so if we look at 5 consecutive work days, we see that this is actually quite a common pattern for this user. And if we look at other participants, we see different patterns. Now, this next person uses their phone much more in relation to their PC, and then this other person almost uses their phone to the exclusion of their PC. And I think what's interesting here, there's a side note, which is that people tend to be different across people, but internally consistent, which has some implications for, if our devices were smart and knew us better, could they provide better experiences? But it's not quite where I'm going to take this talk, but I think that's quite interesting, how obvious that is from the data. So I showed you only 5 consecutive work days, but this is more typical of the amount of data we got for each of our participants. So next I'm going to look at, what were people actually doing on their devices? What is their relationship between them? So we did a simple analysis of what applications and things these participants were in, and for both the PC and the mobile device, web and email shot to the top as the most dominant activities that people were performing, not surprisingly. So if we look back at this sort of someone's day and when their devices were active, and we overlay their email and web activity, it accounts for almost all of their use of both of their machines. So I'm just going to bring that down so you can see it a little bit better. And it looks like email is dominant, but actually it's just because they're so tightly interleaved that if we actually bring the web activity to the front, that looks dominant. And I'm just going to blow up one section of the day, which looks like perhaps lunch hour, and we see them using email and web, interchangeably. Moving quite rapidly between them on their device. Now, this gap in time in lunch, where they sort of clearly seem to move from the desktop to the phone, back to the desktop, is sort of an interesting handoff pattern we saw, where it seems like the phone is being used to sort of connect people at all times to their tasks, and that they're doing email and web on both of them. And so we also looked at different kinds of other kinds of handoff, like in the morning when they use their phone until they get to their desktop, which we saw on over 80% of the days that we logged, and the reverse, where once they leave the PC, they hand off their activity to their phone. So what I'm doing is sort of building a case that, it seems just based on both the interaction patterns that we see temporally in these sort of handoff patterns, and that people are using both email and web, that their activities should be related, or that there's a high likelihood that they could be related, that people aren't totally different people once they move to a different device, right? It seems obvious, but our devices do not actually seem to take this into account. So but we were just looking at data, so we followed up with some people and said, and kind of tried to get some personal perspective on some of the patterns we were seeing, and asked them, are there tasks that you sort of start on one device and finish on the other, and the reverse? And we were actually surprised, and I pulled out 2 quotes just because they sort of highlight 2 patterns we saw. One was, so we actually picked different types of people. Those have sort of different pattern profiles. And this is someone basically saying they've picked the most powerful device they have. Basically, they're trying to use it like a laptop. So here he's saying, he doesn't want to carry a laptop while he's mobile, and when some dork needs their password changed, no worries, boom, you log in and you do it, even when you're in the movie theater. So he's using his mobile device as a first order laptop, so they're asking a lot of their devices and getting a lot out. But when we ask about these kinds of, how related are your tasks between them, this person basically said, and this was reflected in many other people, saying, as long as I make sure that things sync, I don't really see tasks as a true continuation, which I just couldn't believe, actually. So, not like I was looking for, data that wasn't there, but this is where I believe that we don't expect enough from our devices, and so we don't expect them to be sort of related, but I would argue that they are. So I went back and looked at the data and said, so what can we tell from the data? So let's look at how people are looking at websites. If I go and look at the data, so here we see someone is looking at Connector Ride on their desktop, and within 4 minutes they're on their phone looking at the same website, right? Clearly, it's clear to me that's the same activity, and today there's no really way that they would match those activities, and here's another one where they're looking at a patio books, and they're looking for a particular book on their phone, and then within 20 minutes they're looking the same exact book on their desktop. And a final example is here they're looking at Facebook, and we all know that we look at Facebook both on our PCs and our phones, but here the person is looking at a very particular message, and then when they're back at their desktop looking at that same message and going into the compose. So they're doing the same thing with Facebook that we often do with our mobile email, which is we'll read it on one device and write the reply on another device. And then the problem is with URLs. We were able to log URLs, but because the URLs are often formatted differently on the phone versus the PC, they were hard to correlate. And so what we did is we looked just at domains, and from a domain perspective, 75% of 85, missing my my math, of the domains on the phone were ones they'd already seen on the desktop. And so that obviously seems like there's some relation. People are looking at the same kinds of information on both of their devices. But if you can tell, right, this is a blackjack. This is not, this was 2 years ago, so the people were using different kinds of devices that might not have been completely web-enabled. And so I wanted to get at, okay, well, if if people aren't going to the same sites now, would they want to if they had, a better mobile device or better viewing experience on their mobile device? And so what I did is I actually sent them little surveys on their phone, and I knew what URLs they were looking at on their desktops. So I would send them little surveys and say, today, would you be interested in going to this URL on your phone? And I sent these periodically and had them sort of rate them. And then I also gave them a personalized dynamic URLs that sort of list of URLs that they could go to if they wanted to. But that wasn't exactly the point of the study. It was really to get at intention. What percentage of desktop URLs are people likely to want to see on their mobile device? And so here's some of the results. So one thing that I want you to notice is that not all the URLs were created equal. We actually, based on how they looked at it on their desktop, they had different properties like how frequently they visited the site, how long they viewed the site, how recently they viewed it, and so on. And so we actually could analyze their responses based on how they had looked at the URL when they were on their desktop. And we did see that that these certain properties did impact how likely they were to want to view the URL again. So that's interesting. The other thing I want you to look at is actually the numbers are pretty low, right? Like at best, 1 out of 3 of the frequently visited sites they would want to see again, and maybe those are ones they already had bookmarked anyway. But so it's not. So for example, what would we do with this data if we wanted to build new interfaces? One idea is, like I had on the previous page, what if we could provide for someone their own personal, dynamically updating sort of bookmark list based on what they had looked at on their desktop? Would that be a good idea? And since entering text on a phone or on a phone is difficult, and this is saying, well, it's not a bad idea. There's some relationship, but you got to do better probably than 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 3. And so this is sort of this is where I see an open question, right? It looks like we could this could be possible and it might be useful, but clearly just taking some of these basic properties of how they have behaved with the URL in the past does not necessarily predict with high enough confidence how likely they are to look at it again. So that, so from the web perspective, I think there are relationships. I think we can do a better job. Although, what we see today and are, sites that allow you to send a URL from your desktop to your phone, and you can do that intentionally, and oftentimes that's really convenient. But I would argue that you have to know a priori. You need to know that that's something you're going to want to view, and sometimes you don't know that. And so I think there's room for our devices to be smarter than just having putting the burden on the user to make those transitions. But we still have some work to do to understand how to make that experience better when it comes to transitioning. If we do automatic transferring of URLs. So now let's look back at email. Now, email, unlike the web, we weren't looking at the contents of messages. So even though someone, we knew they were in email on both of their devices, we didn't know if they were looking at the same message. But if we take an example from my personal use, so I look at my inbox and I go through them. I'll look at them on my my mobile device, and the first one I can't actually finish dealing with because I need to incorporate this into some presentation I'm doing. The next one I need to file. The third one I can actually finish doing it and that's done, and so on. One involves folders of the PC. So for me, it happens to me all the time that I do something on my mobile device and then finish it later on another device. And that would be a related task, right? Those are related in some way. So now let me ask you, the audience, so how many of you have read something, an email on your mobile device, and then forgotten to reply to it later for some reason once you get back to your desktop? All right, that's like, if the cameras can't see, that was a good 75% of the audience, right? This happens all the time, and I would argue that this is a failing of our systems to understand what sort of where I am in a task and helping me remember and sort of bridge the gap between these different worlds that it's all living on a server, but I'm looking at it through 2 different lenses, and it's not helping me sort of finish a task between those spaces. So, of course, not surprisingly, I get back to my desktop, and these emails that I've only actually dealt with 1 out of 5. Other emails have come in, they've come down the list, they're visually indistinguishable from all the hundreds of other emails that I leave in my inbox, and it's not surprising that one of them can go unaddressed for some reason. So I'm going to come back to that point, but I think there's a fundamental issue in that I will discuss why I think this happens and what I think we can do about it. But I think one issue also is that as applications increasingly make the leap from the desktop to the mobile device, they're often inspired in terms of design and look and feel by their desktop counterparts. And the implication is that the experience is the same, and that you can kind of completely now live in the mobile version and you don't have to worry about the desktop version. But I think this is an illusion. And despite this is an illusion because when we're doing activities on a mobile device, We are constantly sort of bombarded by different kinds of interruptions than we do when we're at the desktop, and it's fundamentally different to do computing on a mobile device than the desktop. And so what we wanted to look at is how these unique experiences of doing things while mobile impact and threaten sort of task completion, and what that means in terms of how we actually ultimately do or do not complete the task and stay productive, where productivity could be anything from social productivity to work productivity. So we wanted to kind of generally identify what are the sources of interruption while you're mobile, and learn from what people are doing to work around these problems so we can understand where the pain points and how do we build systems that can do a better job. And also look specifically at whether there are differences in how well different tasks already support this activity so that we can learn from what's working and what's not. So our approach was to actually capture real moments where people had to defer a task on their mobile device. And we could have just asked them theoretically, but we really wanted these concrete moments. So we had people take screenshots of their mobile device when they encountered some sort of disruption in what they were doing. And then once a day, I would remind them, please upload these and tell us more about it. And so they would upload it and annotate it at a website with what was going on, what caused the problem, how did they plan to follow up on it, how frustrated were they, and so on. And this is sort of a very classic sort of human-computer action technique of experience sampling, like sort of getting in the moment what's going on. And so I had 24 participants. 12 of these people had iPhones, 12 had Pocket PCs, and we had them do this for 2 weeks. And all in all, we got over 400 screenshots of these disruptions in task. And then we took these and we analyzed them in several ways. So if you'll notice, the context, cause, and follow-up were open-ended fields. So we kind of had to code them in some way to understand what the patterns were in people's experience. So the first thing I'll discuss is what are the causes of disruption. We were really interested in developing sort of a classification of what prevents people from completing a task while they're mobile. So I'm going to go through a few and just give you examples. I'm going to go through 6. We came up with 10. But just to give you an idea of these sort of major breakdowns in being able to complete a task. So network. This is not surprising. I'm sure everybody's had this problem. And by the way, I have I'm not beating up on the iPhone. I have 6 examples. 3 of them I've given iPhone examples, 3 Pocket PC examples, and I could have done the reverse. We actually got examples for all of these broad categories. We had examples from both types of device. So we're trying to come up with like more general findings about mobility and not like, oh, what's a particular usability issue with this particular device or not. Like, just learn about the general problem. So here's a network problem, and I'm going to go through more slowly what the responses were. So my phone's browser would not display any web pages. This seems pretty obvious, but this information was important because there were some screenshots where it was not at all clear to us why they took the screenshot, and we really needed that kind of extra data. And so they explained that they had to get on their actual computer at home to check on the web page. I'd originally wanted to simply glance at on my phone. So this is getting at kind of what the problem was and what wasn't working for them. This is a task they wanted to do quickly. They picked up their phone. That's a really common reason why you might look at a web page on your phone versus your desktop, and they were thwarted. So it's not surprising that their frustration was 4 out of 5, where 5 was the highest frustration and 1 was the lowest frustration. So another class of barrier were output problems. So these involve those for which either the screen was too small or there was too much to read or whatever. It was basically got to the fundamental issue that these screens are small and sometimes they don't render things properly, and so it's not a good experience. So here someone says it's a link to an article that I know will have a lot of text, so I decided to wait until I'm at a desktop with a larger screen. So what they did is they marked it as unread on the phone, followed up by reading it at their desktop. So marked as unread is a very common thing that we all do, and that this was we captured someone actually saying this was my follow-up strategy, but I would argue is once the user has to do something to bridge these worlds, our systems are not working well for us. That's something that our devices should be able to accommodate without us having to actually overload that particular action and that state. So it's unclear exactly why, but he found this particularly frustrating. Maybe he was really eager to see the article, but just wasn't willing to read it on his mobile device. Okay, so this is someone's inbox. Input was another barrier, people that just didn't want to enter the text or didn't have the features at their disposal, like, say special characters or formatting that they would need to respond. And so this is several emails that required follow-up, but he didn't want to use his phone to type the messages because it'd just be easier to do it at the computer. And so he was going to go through them at the computer and read them carefully and respond to them, and 1 out of 5. So it's not surprising. This is clearly, a very typical work pattern between doing something, reading email on a mobile device and finishing it later, and this seemed to be fairly par for the course for him. So here, and I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly now that you get the idea of the pattern, but another very common category was things just missing features, right? So this is someone who went to the John L. Scott website, and as you see, this is sort of like the Facebook example where it kind of looks like the John L. Scott website, and who knows what kinds of things he needed to search for, but he was trying to search for homes, but the site lacked the same functionality as the PC version. And it was sort of clear through this, through what the comments that actually this was a surprise to him. He went there expecting to be able to do the task, and he was thwarted. So he'll have to wait and search on his laptop, and so the frustration, understandably, was 4 out of 5 because he went through the effort to get there and was disappointed that it didn't have all of the features. And this was quite common. Another common disruption was environmental disruption. So this is someone that was responding to an email. She was on the bus. She reached her destination before she could complete the email, so she saved it as a draft and completed it when she returned to the office, right? 3 out of 5. Maybe it was kind of annoying. She needed to remember it was in her drafts box, but at least, it saved state, and she was, not overly frustrated about this. And so this is another thing we saw were people just making conscious cost-benefit trade-offs. And these were cases where, in theory, the person could complete the task. Like, it seemed completely possible, but they just were frustrated by how much effort it was going to take, and they decided not to do it. So trying to search using the internet is frustrating and slow, plus some websites don't have the mobile version, so it's hard to view. And this is definitely, I don't want to pretend that it might have been the result of, or the cause of the kind of display, right? This is some kind of Windows mobile device, and it's possible that it was just, certainly the part about not having the mobile versions are hard to view might have been the result of a device, but in fact, we got the same examples also from iPhone. So it could have been that the bar was different, but these are just things that people encounter while they're mobile, is that sometimes the benefit doesn't outweigh the cost, right? So she found the names on the server from the computer and did it later, but was clearly frustrated that it was not easy to do from the phone. So I'm going to jump into just sort of, overview the disruptions. So these were the disruptions that I actually showed you, and I just want to point out that some of these could be improving, right? Maybe, someday network is going to be perfect, or, our screens will get better, or we'll have, glasses that show us plenty of pixels, and so we won't have these problems with output, or somehow we're going to magically be able to use 10-finger input for our mobile devices. And so maybe these are getting better. And I would argue it's not likely that they're ever going to reach the point of a desktop, but you could imagine at least that the bar, or that point at which people feel like they're hitting a barrier, might be pushed out further, at least in some of these. And these are a little bit arbitrary that I picked those, but they're reasonable to assume that they might be getting better. But then there are some that really are probably likely to persist for the foreseeable future, right? It's unlikely that, for example, if we add Word, document editing to phones, that we're ever going to have, say, the word ribbon implemented on the phone. It's just not, maybe, but it's not a reasonable design, really, for the mobile experience. The environment, you're not going to necessarily always be able to control what kinds of interruptions you have. Cost benefit, if I'm on a bus and I have 30 minutes, I might be willing to do this web search, but if I'm at a traffic light, I'm not going to be. And these are completely situationally dependent. So the things to, the takeaways from here are there are bound to be disruptions and that they're task independent. All of these really could happen for most any task you're doing on the device. So that's at least what I take away from this. So we thought we might be able to understand more about where to focus our energy on designing better experiences by looking at users' frustrations and where they had frustrations. And so we first looked at, took the median frustration for these different barriers and saw some patterns. So environment generally was a low frustration. Maybe people are just generally accepting of interruptions. Maybe the time span of the interruption was generally short, and so they could quickly get back to their activity, who knows. But on the other end of the spectrum, network was always extremely frustrating, universally frustrating, and that's not hard to understand why, right? Like, it's unpredictable, they're usually sort of, they want the immediate gratification of whatever they're doing, and it is extremely disrupting and frustrating, and it leaves the user sort of helpless in order to continue the task. Although it's hard to, from a user interface point of view, it's hard to solve the network problem just with software. But so let's move on to, so what we're interested in, we thought, well, maybe what we can learn something about how frustrated people were with how they followed up. So we had this hypothesis that when people have to follow up on a different machine, they're going to be more frustrated than if they can finish it on their phone, on the same device. So we looked at sort of the distribution of how people followed up, and actually twice as many of the instances we got claimed they were going to follow up on their computer versus their mobile device, and then there were a couple that sort of fell into different categories. But so we saw lots of instances of, this is again sort of evidence that tasks are crossing the boundary. But when we cross it with frustration, we actually saw that even statistically, people were less frustrated when they had to move to another device than when they persisted and persevered on the same device. And this could be for a variety of reasons. We can't take all this data and boil it down to, it's just more frustrating to stay on the mobile device, so everything should be able to migrate or something like that. But the thing that I do think it says is that it's not inherently problematic that we do part of a task on one device and finish it on the other. I think that there probably are lots of other factors, but we shouldn't just assume that the goal is always to have people continue the task on the device on which they start it. So the other thing we wanted to look at was, maybe we can learn something about the different tasks. Like maybe some tasks are just less frustrating than the others, and we could learn about, what makes that task more frustrating, or what makes this other task more reasonable to follow up on at a later time. So all of these are pretty close. These are average frustration ratings, and all of these are pretty close in average rating. But statistically, we did find that email and web were less frustrating than media tasks and map and transit tasks. And I can only speculate at what the reason was, but for one, email tends to be synchronized with a server, and so when I do something on my mobile device, it's reflected on the server, and when I get back to my desktop, that state has synchronized. Whereas things like with media, media tends to be very immediate gratification. I'm watching a video, and all of a sudden my video player stops or something, and it's useless to me that I can do it later, or at least it feels useless to me because I want the information now. And the same thing with maps and transit. There seems to be a temporal component where, what good does it do me that I can now see where I'm, what the next turn is when I'm back at my desk, right? So these make sense if you, think about it. But what we also wanted to do was look at, by task, were things more or less frustrating based on where people followed up. And I'm almost at my last chart. I know this is kind of tedious. But and I'm not going to go through all of these, but you do see some were the same. This is how frustrated were they if they followed up on a different device versus the same device. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I think it's kind of an interesting story looking at web and email. So what we see here with, say, let's take email. People were less frustrated when they followed up on a PC than on the mobile phone. So maybe just it wasn't worth it to them, and it was annoying when they had to sort of persevere on the mobile phone. But because the state was synchronized with the back end, it was sort of completely, it was reasonable for them to do the reading task on one device and finish it later on the other device. Web, on the other hand, has a flipped story. And this is kind of interesting because, well, to me it's interesting because there's no obvious, or in place, like we don't have a mechanism to easily transfer web state between devices. Now we have this, certain phone models and things say, or say Chrome allows you to, send to the mobile device and vice versa, but it's not part of the infrastructure today. And so you can imagine that if someone encountered a barrier doing something on their mobile device with the web, and maybe they got to a part of the page, it was just too long, or they got to a part of the page that had a video, having to recreate that context, remember that they hadn't finished it, go back to their desktop, type it in, is just a frustrating experience. And so I think there's a lot to learn from here. The other thing is that it looks like email is kind of a big win. Like email, in terms of sort of cross-device experience, email is kind of a representative example of something that's kind of working for us. And I would argue that in some sense that's true. And if we can think about, everything's moving to the web and services and things like that, you'd think, we're really on the right path. And that once everything lives in the cloud, the problem will be solved. But I just want to take a moment to give you a little bit of information about a survey that we did looking specifically at how people manage email on their mobile device versus their desktop and whether how those experiences differed. And so I'm just pulling out two very broad learnings from that. One is the phone was used primarily for reading, deleting, and short replies. This is not surprising to most everyone in the room. But what this means to me, what I take out of this is that the task flow on the mobile device differs, right? We're choosing to break down the task and do the things on the mobile device that are easy to do and leave the things that are less easy to do to a different machine. And this is very important, right? If our task flow is different on one device than the other, the same interface isn't necessarily going to support us in these two different modes. And then the other thing is that we did see lots of evidence of people sort of inventing workarounds to bridge the gaps between one device and the other, right? So, and the reason why we see these behaviors and people's behaviors is that our systems are insensitive to this difference in task flow and workflow. So this is where I would claim that, that even though it's good news that this is all synchronizing with the back end, that's too simplistic, and that we still see people taking on the burden of bridging these two worlds. Okay, so lessons and challenges. Researchers like to always come up with sort of the generalized findings so that they can say, hey, research community, these are open questions, why don't you go solve these? And I can go back to Microsoft and say, hey, these are the lessons we learned, how can we figure out how to incorporate them into products, and if necessary, make more sort of focused investigations that are applicable. But so one is that tasks, I would say that in my work, I've sort of shown that tasks do span devices, both phones and PCs, and they are related, and that we're not yet fully to the point where our systems are supporting these transitions. But, the suggestion would be we really need to design for migration. And, email is working well, but things like web browsing, is not supported today. And we saw our barriers across all sorts of tasks. So certainly there are many other kinds of tasks where we're not taking into account that you might do half of the activity on one device and finish it up on another. The other is that mobile task interruptions are inevitable. And we saw this because some are related to the environment, some are cost benefit, but we're not going to be able to design away the interruptions. And so what we do need to do is design for resumption, both on the device as well as when we move to a different device, and this could be in the terms of just saving the right state or reminders or any number of things. And the challenges are, well, what are those things, right? I've sort of identified a need, but it's an open question how best to design for these resumptions. task suspensions can be deliberate. So people are deliberately choosing to say read on a mobile device and finish later, and that these are very intentional. And email has all of these components that we can sort of pick and choose which are appropriate to do on one device and which are appropriate to do on the other, but other tasks really aren't that well compartmentalized and broken down. And so I think we really do need to think about designing, I'm talking very, I don't know, academically about tasks, but this is like web browsing, or I'm on Facebook, or these very sort of day-to-day activities might not break down into travel-sized chunks as well. And so I think in terms of, rather than just information snacking, we need to think about how to structure our tasks in order to sort of be productive in little bits and spurts when we have the time, and make sort of progress towards these goals because our tasks are sort of designed to be accomplished sort of in piecemeal. And then finally, just state syncing is not enough. I think it's clear that the fact that I read a message on my mobile device is actually different than when I read it at my desktop. On my mobile device, I might not even get a chance to do anything with it, but on my desktop, I probably did whatever the follow-up activity was. And so this state is different, even though it's visually surfaced as exactly the same. And so I would say that we really need to surface the context of the state changes. So it's not just that my email was read, but that it was read from a mobile device. And so when I get back to my desktop, that's surfaced in a way that triggers, hey, maybe that's something that I need to finish in some way. And I've been using email a lot, but it could be the Amazon cart. If I put it in my cart on my mobile device, it might mean when I get back to my desktop, I want to do more reviews or searching or whatnot, because that task isn't finished. So anyhow, that's all I have. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Okay, we'll take a couple questions. We've got time for a couple questions. Josh.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for sharing that. That was fascinating research. Very cool, and something I'm very much into mobile devices and syncing and everything. And I kind of made a conscious decision a couple years ago to move everything I could into the cloud, onto the web, to deal with these kind of problems, because I didn't have just one device. I had lots. And I wanted to be able to kind of switch between them without much friction. And I didn't hear you talk much about cloud services or things like that. I was thinking and taking notes during your talk that, I use Dropbox and Gmail and Google Calendar and everything, and stay in sync across my devices. And I feel like I can be happy and productive on a range of devices. Do you have any thoughts or information on how the cloud could kind of help this problem?
Yes, I certainly think in terms of having access to the data, that the cloud is the way to go. I mean, and we're moving towards that, and that really will solve a lot of these problems. I actually tend to try to push back a little bit when people say the cloud is the solution, because in some sense, email is the cloud, and we still see people actually having to step in and help bridge the gap between when they do part of an activity on one device and finish it on the other. And if it was just, say, desktops and laptops, there might not be such a difference. But once we move to such a different device like the mobile phone, this is where I say, it's actually relevant that I read something from my mobile device, so that when I'm back at a different device, I know that that's not finished, like that's meaningful to me. And that's not a cloud problem. I mean, in some sense, we're not giving the right granularity to state and surfacing it in the appropriate way. And so I think, email is cloud, and it's broken in some ways, and I think we will find that for a variety of tasks when we move into the cloud, that there still is this difference between how we do the task from these different devices, and that we need some kind of smart surfacing of these different nuances between sort of the state changes. So I do think, cloud is definitely the right way to go, but it doesn't solve the problem, at least the way I think about the problem.
Oh, I was just wondering if your research has any lessons for the future design of, say, tablets?
That's an interesting point. So I would say that it does, in that one of the reasons why you're not doing the same activities on your mobile phone as your desktop are the input and output affordances, right? So it's just harder to enter text on your mobile device. It's harder to see text on your mobile device. For a tablet, that could be, the pivot is different. It might be great to read things, but maybe it's hard to still enter lengthy text. Or, I'm trying to think of like a multimedia, it's still great to watch videos, but maybe there is something else that really having multiple displays, like it still is constrained in terms of if I want to see multiple windows at a time, it's hard to do and synthesize data, for example, from, Excel and Word or something, right? It's not necessarily good for multi-window or something like that, right? Where you could imagine you just saying, you know what, that's not appropriate for this platform, I'm going to do it at a different platform. And so the point at which you make those decisions might be different, but because of the different input and output affordances, there may still be these moments. And so I think that that would be along the spectrum of devices, and that it does have implications for how the tablet device fits into the spectrum.